Good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to this evening's webinar session with Informa Webinars. My name is Delna Kama, and I would like to invite you to Your Brain and Learning Needs Assessment with Seema Nagarath Menon. I'd like to introduce you to Seema Nagarath Menon, who is an international speaker and an ATD expert facilitator. She's also Marshall Goldsmith Stakeholder-Centered Coach and Senior Learning and Development Specialist based in Dubai. As an ATD-approved facilitator and a subject matter expert in her profession, Seema currently leads the Learning Needs Assessment Certificate and the CPLP exam prep courses for Informa in the region. I'm now going to hand over to Seema.
Hi, everyone. This is Seema here, as Delna just introduced me. Thanks, Delna, for that. Welcome to the webinar today on your brain and the learning needs assessment. We are going to be talking for the next half hour on the relationship between learning needs assessment and neuroscience, especially the neuroscience of learning. So let me begin by asking you, do you know how many neurons we have in our brain? Can you type in a number in the chat box? How many neurons do you think there are in any person's brain? Can you just type in your chat box? 100 billion neurons. 100 billion neurons, and of that, 10,000, each neuron is connected to another 10,000. So you know what a complex object we have on our shoulders, our brain. So if you just take a tiny bit of our brain, the amount of connections you will find in that would be as many as the Milky Way. If you take a single neuron, you will find the amount of complexity that it has as much as New York City. So that's really how complex our brain is. Now, today there is a new field of study called the Mind, Brain, and Education, MBE, which really sits at the crossroads of neuroscience, education, and psychology. And this is what studies, this field studies the neuroscience of learning. It explains what in brain science works in terms of learning. So I'm going to use some of the information from that to explain to you how neuroscience of learning is linked to needs assessment. Right. So let's first talk about the biggest myths, just briefly look at myths, because neuroscience being a new field, we have a lot of information which is not really based in facts. So let's discuss just one or two big myths that we have. So again, to ask you a question, what percentage of your brain do we use at any time? Your brain, how much of it do you use? Can you write a percentage? What it would be? Would it be, okay, some of you say 10%, some of you say 5%. Oh, some of you say 2%. No, really, you are underestimating yourself, because how much of our brain we use is actually not 10% or less or more. It is actually 100%. We use all of our brain. And the reason I say this is because all in our brain, different parts of the brain are dedicated to different functions. So one part of the brain looks after your walking, the other talking, breathing, etc. Different parts of the brain have different functions. And we discovered this from looking at brain damaged people. If you look at brain damaged people, they only lose function of that part of their body which is associated with that part of the brain. So really, you are using 100% of your brain at any time, though different areas. So there's another myth that we have, which I would like to dispel, and is directly related to learning, is directly related to we as talent development and learning and development professionals. And that myth is that the brain structure of any given person is more or less determined by how much is grown by the age of 5, some say 10. That means it doesn't really change and grow and develop after a certain age. This is a myth. This is a myth because at any given time, a single cell can grow as much as 15,000 connections with its neighbors. So if you look at this picture here, which has the neurons and synaptic connections, if you look at the extreme left, you would see that if a person had to learn a skill like driving, for example, that is what that brain would look like. The synaptic connections would look like that. But as you learn the skill or you learn something new, like driving, as I said, the synaptic connections become denser, and then your brain and the synaptic connections look like what you see on the extreme right. So that's your brain changing upon learning. And this is another picture which highlights the same, that if you look at a newborn, how do the synaptic connections look? And if you see a 1 month, 9 months, 2 years, and an adult, you see the denseness of the synaptic connections are different. That's because your brain is changing on learning. And it's always changing at any age, even when you're much, 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 much older. So this was the concept. The concept of neuroplasticity was put forward by looking at the hippocampus of London cab drivers. Now, hippocampus is that part of the brain which is meant for visual spatial memory. And they found that London cab drivers had a very significantly big hippocampus than to normal people. Uh, that is because sorry, these slides have, as I said, have a mind of their own. So okay, so that is because quite simply they navigate the complex roads of London, and therefore that area of the brain is much thicker than a normal person's. And it depends also on the number of years. If they have more years of experience, it's bigger. And when they stop driving after a certain period of time, the hippocampus comes back to normal. So really the brain is changing with learning. And this is a GIF image which I would like to show you, which is, it just kind of goes in a circular loop of how the synaptic connections are forming in your brain when you're learning something new, and there's neuroplasticity happening in your brain. So how is all this connected to learning needs assessment? What is the connection between learning needs assessment and neuroscience? Well, it's directly related to two things. It optimizes the learning conditions, and it helps making learning stick. Now, that making learning stick, I'm sure you would agree, is one of the biggest challenges of talent development and learning development professionals. So doing a learning needs assessment has a direct relation to neuroscience, and it helps in these two areas of neuroscience of learning. So what is needs assessment? If one were to ask, what is needs assessment? Needs assessment is the process of gathering data to determine what individual performers need in order for the organization to accomplish its stated goals. And what is most important here really is, one is the organization's goals, business goals, and relating the individual's performance and doing performance improvement related to these organization goals. That's what needs assessment is about. But what happens generally in organizations? Well, you have the managers and the stakeholders coming to L&D professionals and saying, well, you know what, we need training. But you have to understand that when working on learning and development projects, many immediately race to create course materials and roll out initiatives without upfront analysis of what is driving the need or how to ensure results. We often, as L&D professionals, would operate in what is called the order taker mode, relying on information from the requester about things like content, learner needs, etc. But I think it's essential that you clearly identify the problem you're trying to solve before you spend time, money, and effort in developing a solution for that problem, because you may have developed a great training class, but what if the training wasn't the issue, right? So let me give an example out here. Like if you were to go to a doctor and you would ask for, I mean, you're not well and you ask for treatment, and the doctor picks up the first medicine he can find and he gives it to you and he says, here, eat that. Well, the chances that it will benefit you, help you get better, are very, very slight. Maybe a placebo effect, but that's about it. However, if the doctor is a good doctor, a wise doctor, well, they would ask questions, the relevant questions. They would perhaps prescribe certain tests and investigations. And on the basis of the questioning and the investigation reports, they would come to a diagnosis and the correct diagnosis. And then they would prescribe the correct treatment, which will have the necessary impact and get you well. Similarly, sorry, without first conducting a needs assessment at the start of any L&D project, organizations may spend their time and money on training that is either overdone, not needed, or completely missing the intended outcome. So what do we need to do? We need to do a needs assessment, a learning needs assessment, if we can have targeted interventions. So you would ask, well, okay, so what is the learning needs process? What goes in learning needs assessment process? Well, to briefly give you an overview so you could understand it, it starts with an organizational analysis of the organizational goals, the business goals. This could be at a macro level in the organization, or it could be at a department level. But understanding business goals in terms of how the organization can either increase its revenue or decrease costs is the number one thing to do. And then based on your understanding of the business and organization goals, business goals, you would try and see what's the desired performance to lead to these organizational and business goals. And then examine what is the current performance of the people. And the gap between these two and the causes of the gaps for this performance gap would give you an idea of what you need to address. And then, of course, you look at the performers, what they already know, what are their learning preferences, what are their motivations, and so on and so forth, because you are creating learning interventions for these performers. So that's a very important part of your analysis. Based on all this, you would go in for your learning solutions, and not necessarily training. It could be other recommendations. It could be other things other than knowledge and skills gaps. So you would look at the full picture. You will have an open systems approach to understand which is the best potential solution. And then you would give your findings and recommendations. This is an overview of the learning needs assessment process. So what are we looking at in learning needs? The three most important things we would look at, as I said, the organization analysis, what the organization wants to achieve. The performance analysis, that means what is the current reality in terms of the desired behaviors, what are the current behaviors or performance, and what is the gap and the causes for it. And of course, most important, who are the performers? What do they already know? And what do they need? And how we can address these gaps. This is what you would be looking at in a needs assessment. So again, you'd ask, well, that's fine. I know now what is needs assessment. But how is this related to neuroscience? How can I leverage learning in my participants, learners, in the people in the organization by understanding the neuroscience behind learning needs assessment? Well, there are two things we will look at in terms of neuroscience of learning, and that is phase locking, which is attention and focus, and scaffolding. These are two concepts in neuroscience which support learning if you do a needs assessment. So let's take the first one, which is phase locking and attention and focus. So phase locking is a term which was coined by Richard Davidson, who is one of the leading experts in neuroscience or psychologist in the University of Wisconsin. And he said for people to learn to focus is most important. Attention and focus is most important because what you pay attention to is what is encoded. It's what what the learner or what the person can memorize, because it is encoded in our brains. So if you lock onto something, we are tuned into it. And if you're tuned into it and we have focused attention on it, we will be able to retain it and remember it much better. And this is the place I'd like to tell you that this is one of the reasons multitasking is a bad idea. So how do we create these attention hooks? Well, one is, of course, personal relevance. And this is one of the most important. Then you have things like emotional appeal or novel stimuli or hands-on experience. But out of this, the most important is personal relevance, because what is personal relevance? Personal relevance is something that is interesting and worth knowing for a person. It answers the question, WIIFM, what's in it for me? And once you have that, the person is engaged, the learner is engaged. And it is not only for attention, but it's also for holding the attention of whoever it is, the learner. And the way you can do this is by understanding what the performers want, what they need, who they are, what are the performance gaps, how do they fill it. So once you have this information, only can you create this personal relevance for the learners and then have the attention hooks. So it's directly related to needs assessment, because needs assessment will tell you what the performers want, who they are, what they require, and what the performance gaps are. Right. Now, the next one you have is what is called scaffolding. Scaffolding is another concept in neuroscience, which tells about how people form memories. So, what happens is scaffolding is a form of learning where everything we already know forms a base for new learning. So we scaffold new concepts into existing ones. So our previous knowledge acts as hooks for new knowledge. And the stronger this hook, the easier it is for us to learn. So learning is not it's not a linear process. It is through a network of associations, as you can see in the image here. So every learning forms on the basis of what we already know, and it forms those hooks on which we put new learning. So if you were to walk into a room and you get the smell of coffee, well, what would happen? You would perhaps imagine the coffee cup in your hand. You would maybe get a bit of the taste in your mouth. You would know what it feels like. All your senses would tell you what coffee is with that one instance of smell. All the other associations would come about. So this is because our memories are through associations. So if I were to tell you to memorize a list of important dates in Mongolian history, now that's going to be a challenge for you, because this is totally new and you wouldn't know how to go about it, and it would take you a long time to do that. However, I'll tell you a real-time example of mine, which I encountered recently, which will help you understand network of associations a little more. I went to Japan a couple of weeks back, and the people's name were a bit of a challenge for me. They were new. I didn't know the pronunciation, and it was difficult for me to memorize, or I had to keep asking people again and again, embarrassingly. However, there's one name which I really, the person just said it once and I knew it. And that was our tour guide. She came into the bus and she smiled at everyone and she said, hi, everyone. My name is Yumi. You and me. Simple. Yumi. And I didn't have to ask her name again, and I still remember it because it was so simple for me. I just hooked on the new name to my own learning. My old learning act as a base for the new learning because it's a network of connections. So how is this relevant again in terms of needs assessment, learning needs assessment? Well, again, if you do a learning needs assessment and you know your learners, you know what their work profile is like, what their gaps are, what they require, who they are. All your examples, metaphors, analogies, or stories, or case studies, or whatever you use in your learning would be directly related to what they already know and what they already need. And that again is going to create personal relevance. And as I said, personal relevance is very, very important for learning to take place, because I'm sure you may have, as learning and development professionals, heard a couple of times, learners saying, yes, but, the learner says, yes, but what am I going to use this information for? Or what's this have to do with me? So if the learners have to ask such questions, then of course there is no learning. So personal relevance, how something is interesting and what knowing is very important for learning transfer. And that can be addressed with a good learning needs assessment. So learning needs assessments is directly related to brain-friendly learning. It optimizes learning conditions and helps make learning stick by two ways: phase locking, which is attention and focus, and scaffolding. So that's the basis of a good learning needs assessment and the requirement for it, basis in neuroscience. Thank you so much for joining me and joining us for this webinar. And if you have any further questions, maybe you could, send an email and I will receive it and I will answer it to whatever your requirements are. And if you would like to know about learning needs assessment, you would like to understand the whole process, as I explained to you earlier, practical implications, and knowing what tools you can use, please consider joining the Learning Needs Assessment Certificate Program on the 12th and 14th. So thank you again very much. Take care and have a great day.